I'm joined today by Jonathan Ray, who is a Bristol-based radio broadcaster and voiceover artist. Welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we're recording this podcast today from Happy Hours Studio, which is right in the heart of Bristol. You're born and raised here. Why do you think that Bristol is such a great place to live and work in?
Because it's not a sprawling metropolis like some of the bigger cities in the UK, and yet it still has that undercurrent of being bustling, of being busy, of being creative. It has a very chilled out kind of vibe about it. A lot of people come here to work or to study and end up staying here. There's some kind of magnet. It's bizarre, this place. It's like a great secret that everyone knows about.
Obviously, we've just kind of touched on the fact that Bristol is quite a creative place. Am I right in thinking that you went to college with quite a famous artist?
I don't know that for sure, all right? But if it is who it is believed it is, a few years ago, the name was revealed in the press that, yeah, I was in the same tutor group at Sixth Form College with Banksy. If it is indeed him, I can't say that it was.
Do you remember him?
I do.
Was he very good at art?
We did the same courses, but not in the same classes, funnily enough. But I don't remember anything about him that was to do with stencils or art. I don't remember any of that at all. But he was funny. He was very, very, very funny. So you can sort of see where that humour comes from, if indeed it's him.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I'd say it was. It's a good story.
It's not me. All right, just to let you know.
Even with the cool shirt on.
This is not a Banksy. It was stripes, but I put it in a boil wash by mistake.
So why do you think Bristol is such a creative place? He's like one of the most famous creative people to come from the city, but there are lots of others. Why do you think it has been so creative and still is?
I mentioned about space earlier on, and I think it isn't that sort of buzzing metropolis. I think it does give you that space to think. You can drive 15 minutes out of Bristol and be in lovely ruralness, as it were, and I think that helps. But also, you're not a million miles away from London and or Birmingham or anywhere like that, a major city. You've got an airport here as well, so it has good links for a lot of things. So I think it's just a very sort of not casual place to be, but I think it allows for creative, and it has a reputation for things like protest and things like that. And I think maybe that those sorts of things get thrown into that melting pot, as it were, of ideas that Bristol is famous for. And I think that's probably why, or one of the reasons why anyway.
The BBC has a massive presence here, or has had a massive presence over the years with the Natural History Unit. Perhaps that's something as well that an offshoot of that are all the kind of independent production companies and all the facilities, houses as well, that kind of help support that.
Well, to think that when I was growing up watching Take Heart, not realising that Morph was being made here, along with Take Heart, and you have Aardman here as well. It's great that Bristol just seems to be that magnet for, and I suppose it just spawns from that. People see that places like Aardman are here and want to come here too. It's just, you only need some big players to be here that acts as a sort of a gravitational force for others to be pulled in.
You have had... Well, is it 30 years? Something like that?
Something like 30 years.
30 years working in the radio industry as a broadcaster. What drew you to radio in the first place? Rather than TV, rather than moving pictures, what was it about radio that you liked when you were, a child and kind of thinking about what you wanted to do for a job?
Totally by accident. And I remember the night, I can tell you. I remember getting my first ever clock radio, which was quite exciting because I could listen to radio late at night in my bedroom or first thing in the morning. But I remember being just quite bored one evening. The radio, the music, we didn't have a lot of radio to listen to, and we certainly didn't have digital like we have now. And I'd happened to just be tuning around, and I heard a radio phone in, and it was, bizarrely, it was on a Thursday night, and it was local commercial radio, GWR radio back in the day. And it was a late night phone in to do with personal problems. And I was just intrigued that there was a host there with a woman answering people's questions. They didn't know who they were. They never met them before. And I was just sort of hooked that there was this bizarre conversation going on that I was sort of eavesdropping on. And I was part of that conversation, even though I wasn't actually involved.
So do you think that that's kind of the crux almost of what a lot of radio is? You feel like you're in the room and you're obviously not contributing to the conversation, but you're there and are kind of part of it. You're part of that conversation, and it's almost like they're kind of speaking to you.
It's that one-to-one medium that you don't get elsewhere, that conversational. You know, when you're on the radio, you're always told to imagine that you're talking to one person, imagine the person that you're talking to. And that's what it did to me. And that's absolutely right. But you can be part of the conversation. Anybody could have picked up the phone and been part of that. Nowadays, you can text, you can email, you can WhatsApp things in, you know. So you can be part of that conversation. And you're often invited by radio stations and radio shows to do that. So it still contains that one-to-one element. But you've always been part of the show, and you always will be, as far as I'm concerned.
Just jumping forward a bit, because I want to go back and kind of hear about your career path and various jobs that you've done. But nowadays, you have cameras rigged up in radio studios, don't you? How did you feel about that when that was first introduced? And is that something that you're really conscious of when you're broadcasting now, or is it something that you don't really consider?
Well, it's different now. It was quite funny. Radio went through a phase of having webcams in studios before they had all cameras all over the place and on rails. Some studios have cameras on rails going around. So the webcam thing was quite interesting because you could see into people's studios. You could see their working environment, which was actually quite interesting. So I was always very conscious of a webcam being there, to be honest with you. So, okay, I didn't go into radio to move into television necessarily, but you have to accept that it's part of the development. For some places, not every radio station does it, but visibility is something that is becoming the norm. It's very handy for social media to clip out something from an interview or a bit that you've done on air, especially if you've done like a team chat with the radio, and that can go viral. So I see the benefit of it, and it's just one of those things you kind of have to embrace. You can still approach the radio stuff that you're doing in the same way, just maybe the way that people experience it is different.
Tell me about your background. Which radio stations have you broadcast from? What types of radio shows have you presented over the years? What was the starting point? How did you kind of cut your teeth?
Right, I'll try and be, we're told to be brief sometimes on the radio, so I'll try and do it the brevity way, but I can't promise that. I had that initial, when I was at 14, listening to that late night radio show, and I was hooked on phone-in radio, and then hooked on local commercial radio. Although I listened to a lot of things, local commercial radio was quite interesting because it spoke to me, and it was designed for a younger demographic compared to perhaps BBC local radio, which was something that my folks might listen to. So I grew up listening to the traffic guy, bizarrely talking about the A38, and I used to think it was a time check saying 8:38. I hadn't really realised that the A38 was a road. So that's what I remember about local travel back in the day. And so I thought, I really want to get into this. I was really kind of hooked. At the time, the programme Midnight Caller, I think it was quite big on the television late on a Saturday night. And I thought, I want to get on the inside of this. I want this sort of mystical vision of what's going on the radio station. I want to be part of. So I joined the Bristol Hospital Radio Broadcasting Service, which I did for 3 years before I moved away. And that was great fun. It really was, because you met interesting people, and you had a chance you actually learned a lot about the people that are listening. I mean, obviously, when you're talking to people in hospital, they're there because they're not very well, or, you know, and obviously have various conditions and are having medical interventions and what have you. So you have to be very considerate of that when you're broadcasting on the hospital radio and the music that you play and that kind of thing. So you learn straight away about an audience. Straight away, we always talk about, you know, knowing your audience. Wow, you know, that was quite an introduction. And then from then...
How old were you, did you say, when you did that? 16.
I tried to join at 15 and 14, but they wouldn't have me because of insurance reasons. So, and then one night, I took a call from the local station, GWR, which is now part of the big global... Well, GCAP became global. But it was just based here on the watershed in Bristol. I took a call, and they were looking for technical operators, people to operate the desk in certain circumstances. And they said, we've heard some good things about you. Would you like to come? And I did. And I used to go, what the situation was then was that the programs were coming from one studio, but the ads came from another. And so basically, when it was time to play an ad break, you listened for the cue, pulled the fader down, pressed the ads.
All done manually, literally press the ads.
Press the ads, which were all on tape or what we called carts. And so you might have a cart rack of 4 to 6 machines, but of course an ad break could last 3.5 minutes, but it might take 8 or 10 carts or something like that. So you'd load up the machines, but then you have to listen, because once the top one had finished playing and fired off the next one, you pull the top tape out and replace it with the next one. So, and try and make sure it all segued properly, and that the cart was re-queued back to the beginning. That was always a bit of a problem. And also, hopefully, that the tape wouldn't snap in the machine. So that was how I started. And I did that for a little while. And then I moved away to be a student, and I did the same tech hopping thing at the radio station I worked at there. I worked on a radio station that was broadcasting really ahead of its time, actually, on satellite. So people were listening to the radio station in their living rooms, where it's second nature now sometimes, but back in the day, people weren't doing it. And so one night they needed someone to cover, and I happened to be in the right place at the right time, did a couple of links, and that's where it started. As a freelancer, you have to kind of do everything really, because it's easy to be pigeonholed, but I kind of like to get the variety of work that I can, because I have a broad range of interests. So I've done news and current affairs. If you're looking at speech-based BBC radio, so news and current affairs. I've done sport, religion, arts and culture, horticulture. Have I mentioned sport? I can't remember all these things. In commercial terms, I've done top 40 radio, I've done gold, I've done easy listening, I've done classical. And it's quite a broad range. And it does mean that I can be sort of parachuted in to present programs at short notice, which has happened, especially if there's a situation where there's a news story about to break or something has developed. I can get a call and say, can you come in and do this? It's quite useful, really. Just have a broad interest in everything. So current affairs, sport, music. I did a gardening phone-in for 10 and a half years. And actually, that was the one I didn't have a great deal of interest in gardening, but I was the funny man to the serious guy. And it worked. So we just kept doing it. But I'm not a horticulturalist. So I would never pretend to be an expert in any of those fields.
But you don't have to be. Your part there is to ask the questions that we want to hear, isn't it? And so you don't need to be an expert. I suppose when you're presenting sports-based programs, you need to have some level of knowledge of Bristol City or the football or things
City
that have
and
gone...
Rovers. If you're presenting a program locally, they have programs for both City and Rovers. So you need to know a bit there. But if you're doing the general sport program, like on a Saturday afternoon or a midweek match, you need to be a bit more general, because if City and Rovers are playing, or Yeovil Town as well, they get covered. So you need to sort of have a broad range of what's going on within those teams. So you can just sort of talk to the commentators and summarisers, which is important really, because the fans will then pick up on some of that. They will want to have their say, especially if their team has lost or won, and they're angry, frustrated, or over the moon.
As far as more challenging areas of work, what would you say have been the most, kind of where you've had to react to something quickly, or anything that breaking news, like you said?
Well, the thing is that the most challenging moments are when you have to throw away the running order because something has happened, or you have to make an adjustment to a running order. Now, the smaller things is because the guest hasn't turned up or something, so you have to fill for a bit, or you go to another item. And very often, the thing about radio, you see, is that on television, if it was a live program, there's people in the gallery doing it all for you. In radio, there is someone behind the glass sometimes, but they could be doing something else. They could be fielding a phone call, trying to get someone to come on and do something. So as the presenter, most of all the things I do are self-opt. So I operate the desk myself whilst talking. So imagine I'm sitting here, but I've got a control panel in front of me, a mixing desk. So I might be talking whilst playing with the machine, trying to find the next piece of audio that I can go to, whilst the producer or assistant next door can deal with what they've got to deal with. That's where radio can be quite useful if it's not visible, because then listeners can't see that going on. So there's that. But then other instance as well, I was on air when 9/11 happened, for instance, and I saw this all happening, unfolding on the TV screen, and straight away you just think, well, I've got all this top 40 music here. We've got one of the world's biggest terrorist incidents happening in front of us. I think we ought to, as we're talking about it, we have to sort of tone back on the music. And I was working for a big organisation then that did, send round a new music policy for the afternoon. But locally, I just took the decision to sort of just pull back a bit. And you have to sort of just think on your feet in these occasions. And so any occasion when you throw away the running order and you almost like have a blank sheet of paper as you're going along, that's the challenge. Royal deaths. I've been on air when Diana, Princess of Wales, died, and also the Duke of Edinburgh as well.
And how about politics and general elections?
I've done the last 3 general elections. They're really interesting because you get the exit poll at 10 in the evening. You expect, or you can anticipate, that maybe a prominent politician might lose their seat, but you don't know where it's going to be in the country, and you think, well, could it be around here? So you have to sort of think about that eventuality and what the questions might be that you ask that politician, if indeed you get to talk to them, because you don't know. You have no idea what's going to happen until the results start coming in.
Who do you think listens to radio these days? I imagine COVID changed things a bit during those few years. I imagine people might have been listening to the radio more. It might have become more important in people's lives for one reason or another. Who do you think listens to it, and why do you think there may have been that increase over the past recent years?
Well, the interesting thing about COVID was it usually, for a lot of radio stations, the big show is the breakfast time. But I suppose with working from home, which people still do now, that has sort of skewed some figures. Things have sort of started to settle down, I think, but it did sort of cause quite an effect. The thing is, audio is so accessible these days. Radio stations have so many ways of monitoring who is listening and how they're listening. For instance, there is the general radio research methodology called RAJAR, which is for all radio stations that subscribe to it. But of course, if you have a digital offering, you can check the numbers daily. You could almost have your own audience research to hand, which is quite exciting. You see where the peaks and troughs are. And I think that has been quite an interesting and exciting development potentially. It's not always very good because if you're listening to something, I mean, I've been involved when you're doing a program and you can see the graph doing that, and then you see it doing that, and you think, what am I doing wrong? And it's not always a very good thing to see in real time, how people are listening. But I think the fact that radio stations are addressing, they're trying to capture as many people as they possibly can. If you look at things like Heart, for example, it has its Heart main station, but it also has things like Heart 70s, Heart 80s, Heart 90s, Heart Dance. There's Smooth, which has Smooth Country, Smooth Chill, Smooth Relax. There's so much of this around now that it's almost super serving the audience. The audience can pick and choose. They haven't just got to turn on and wait for something that they want to hear. They can get to it quite quickly. And radio stations have to do that because there's so much more audio around, podcasts and that kind of thing, and streaming music. So it's quite an interesting playing field, quite dynamic and commercially quite exciting.
So how has radio changed over the years?
The technological changes have allowed the presenter to focus on what they're doing on the air. So in the old days, you'd have to get a record and cue it up, or if you were playing a piece of tape, spool it onto the reel, and all that faff. Whereas you don't have to do that now. The audio you edit digitally, you can insert it into the playlist and just press play and go. So it does free up the presenter to think more about how they might approach linking and what they say between two pieces of music, or going into an ad break or something like that, or going into an item.
So commercial radio is obviously a mixture of programming funded by the ads, essentially. What do you think makes a good ad, a good radio ad?
Advertising takes so many different forms, but the radio advert is still that, it has to still have that one-to-one aspect to it. It has to have that, I'm talking to one person with my product and I want this person to buy this product or to be influenced by this ad. So I still think has to contain the fundamental aspect of what radio is about.
Why do you think radio ads work? Is it because, like you've said, it's that one-to-one nature again?
I think so. It's really funny. I remember speaking to an advertiser once who said to me that they used to run an agency for, I think it was lorry drivers. And the advert, they said to me they would get calls in the middle of the night because the advert would be running through the night as well as during the day. And there'd be truckers and they'd hear the advert and would ring up thinking someone would be there. The amount of times that this person's mobile would ring. And so it clearly has an effect. It clearly, if you hit the right person at the right time, it clearly has an effect. And I'd never considered that before, but talking to an advertiser like that was a real tangible evidence of how advertising can work.
So as well as being a really experienced radio broadcaster, you're also a voiceover artist. So tell me a little bit about that, about the kind of work that you do as a voiceover artist.
Whatever I'm asked to do, whatever I pitch for, I suppose. I remember once doing a voiceover and I totally rehearsed one script and then ended up being a character on an advert for Bosch, which was quite random, really, because I wasn't expecting to. But the client had heard the voices that were pitched, liked them, but wanted to switch them round. They thought my voice would be more suited to, I think I played a husband. And so it was a husband and wife ad with the voiceover tagged on the end. I was supposed to be the voiceover tagged on the end, but it didn't work that way. It doesn't matter. So I've done things like that. I've done corporate narrations for internal videos, intranet videos, and audiobooks as well. I've had a few audiobooks too. I did a few of those during lockdown. So I did one in a studio and then two during lockdown, which was quite an interesting, it was a start of lockdown during COVID. And so we were all sort of just learning, not as much learning, but realizing what you could do with a computer and a mic and a bit of software at home. And that was quite interesting too. So I've done a few audiobooks. I've narrated a book about David Bowie, a book about audio production.
How long does like an average book take to record? And are you actually listening to the words that you're reading, or do you just become okay?
Yeah, you're listening because, of course, you want to try and you're relaying someone else's words, so that's important. It was very funny. There was I can't say it on here because it contains bad language. The famous poem by Philip Larkin about your mum and dad, and I had to read that in one of these books, and I managed to find Philip Larkin reading it himself. I did a really rubbish attempt at copying it. But yeah, you want to try and get across the emphasis of the words. And again, it's that one-to-one thing. You're reading a story to someone. You're telling them something. But you're kind of a custodian of someone else's words. It's quite interesting, really. Because I also produce audiobooks, just to make it clear. I don't just voice them, I produce them as well. And very often when you have the reader who is also the person who's written the book, that's quite interesting. And I have sort of said to them, well, these are your words, so read them as if you're telling me in a conversation how tell me these are your words so you can take ownership of them. Whereas if you are narrating an audiobook, you're kind of the custodian of someone else's words. And so you want to do the best you possibly can to convey what they have written. It's like an orchestra playing, I don't know, Tchaikovsky, for example. They're the custodian of the notes, and it's all in the interpretation.
So when you receive a script from a client for it could be for a radio ad or for some content, voiceover for content, what are the initial questions that you ask? What do you need to know in order to be able to deliver your read?
Well, I might be interested in the brand, and what the sort of the brand values are of this organisation, and the audience as well. Usually, if I am doing this, I very often have someone from the organisation sitting in on the session, which helps because you have the tech people there and the producer of the thing, but also someone from the organisation, which is quite good because sometimes they can pick up on things that others don't. And remember, they're the audience, or they know their audience. So it's quite handy to have them there. There was one session I did in Cottam around the corner, and I thought it was okay, but in my mind, I thought I could have delivered the line a bit differently. No one else picked up on it, and I thought, okay. And then the client actually said, I didn't quite notice, and I thought, yes, they heard exactly what I heard. So it's quite interesting what the client sometimes hears. So usually it's quite good to have them around, I think. Sometimes it adds a bit of pressure because you think, right, okay, I've got to perform for the person giving the money. But at the same time, it's useful to have them there because they know the nuances and they know the values of the organisation that they represent.
So finally, this podcast is called The Happy Half Hour. And we like to find out from our guests what make them happy in work, their professional lives. What do you think has been the happiest time, or any kind of key moments, or just in general, what makes you happy about the work that you do?
I think when you come off air and you feel that it's gone really well, you've covered if it's a news thing like I do for local radio, local BBC radio, if you've covered the story, you've asked the right questions, you've done your best, you've had good audience interaction or whatever the aims were, provided you've met those objectives, that's great. Other times as well, when you have to throw the running order out of the window because something has happened. I mentioned breaking news. There's other things too when things go wrong technologically. There was one incident where in the racks room where all the kit is kept, something wasn't ventilated or something didn't work and the system overheated and probably melted, which was difficult because no technology worked in the building. We didn't have any ISDNs. We couldn't do anything in terms of creating audio or transferring audio, couldn't play any audio. So it was like going back to the old days, not quite tape, but playing music off a CD, which we don't do. It's all off of a computer. And it was moments like that, especially when it's acknowledged by management who can trust you to keep the thing ticking over whilst they go and deal with another situation. It's like I was saying to you earlier about how something sort of falls over on the air. If you can sort of take over live and do stuff, and which means that your producer or whoever's working with you is freed up to deal with the important aspects, and you can keep things, it's like that typical thing, that the graceful swan, but underneath, you're paddling away. So there's that. Also, I think if you know, and sometimes you don't know, that what you've done on the air has had the right effect. You've touched the audience in some way through a story you've told, or an item that you've played, or an interview that you've done. If you get the response through a text or a phone call or an email, that's lovely, that's great. The knowledge that what you've done has touched the audience, that's what makes you happy.
Nice sign off.